The support bracket on the 38th floor catwalk at Orion Heights did not fail by accident. Someone had treated the steel joint with a chemical compound that slowly ate through the alloy from the inside, and on the morning of Linda Halbert's site inspection, that bracket gave way and sent the most powerful CEO in Chicago sliding toward a 40-foot drop. The man who caught her wrist and pulled her back was a janitor who had been emptying her office trash 30 minutes earlier. His name was John Gabriel. He was not nobody. He just needed the world to think he was. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel, and it proves that powerful stories resonate everywhere. John Gabriel had once been one of the most respected materials scientists in the country. He had published 4 papers in peer-reviewed engineering journals, led the recertification analysis on the Decker River Bridge, a project still considered a gold standard in structural auditing across the industry, and had worked as lead analyst at Meridian Structural Labs, where his ability to identify material failure at a molecular level was considered near extraordinary by the engineers around him. He was the person that 3 separate engineering firms called when a problem did not make sense and nothing else was working. He was, by every professional measure, exactly the kind of person who matters. None of that was visible at Orion Heights, the 60-story mixed-use tower that Reed Global was building in Chicago's West Loop. There, John wore white maintenance clothes, pushed a cleaning cart to the access corridors, and was known by the site crew as the quiet guy on the 3rd floor rotation who always finishes rounds on time and never caused problems for anyone. He was polite when spoken to and invisible when not. He kept his head down and his opinions to himself, and nobody ever asked him anything, because nobody thought to ask the janitor anything. He had chosen this deliberately, and it had taken real effort to choose it and keep choosing it every morning for 3 years. His wife Rachel had died when he was 35. It was a Tuesday afternoon in June, a brain aneurysm, sudden and completely without warning. Maya was 4 years old. John was at work, 40 miles away, analyzing a stress fracture in a bridge pier when his phone rang. By the time he got to the hospital, it was already over. 3 days of specialist equipment, and every procedure the hospital had to offer produced an enormous stack of bills, and did not save Rachel. The bills came in waves afterward, for 2 months after the funeral, envelope after envelope, until the total settled at $114,000. John took 3 months of bereavement leave from Meridian. During those months, he understood that he was not going to be able to go back. The lab was 40 miles away, and the hours were unpredictable. Late nights, early mornings, weekend call-ins when something urgent came through. Before Rachel died, this had been manageable because she was there. After Rachel died, it was not manageable because nobody was there. Maya needed to be at school by 8 and picked up at 3:15, and John had no family close enough to help and no budget for full-time childcare that would stretch reliably across the kind of hours that a senior analyst schedule demanded. He found a maintenance position at Orion Heights through a jobs board. It was 12 minutes from Maya's school. The hours were fixed, 7 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. The pay was modest enough that at his monthly payment rate, the medical debt would be cleared in 9 years. Maya would be 16. John wrote that number on the inside cover of his work notebook and looked at it sometimes when the work felt particularly small. 16. That was the plan. That was the whole plan for 9 years. He was not unhappy in the way that people imagine when they hear a story like that. He was contained. He had a daughter who was sharp and funny and currently obsessed with architecture, who drew buildings in her notebooks the way other 7-year-olds drew horses, and who could not fall asleep unless he sat on the edge of her bed and told her 3 facts about something she had not known before. He had a routine that worked. He had the 5:15 mornings with coffee and thick novels that required no expertise and carried no weight. He had made a life that fit the shape of his grief, and the shape was small and sturdy and it held. What he had decided, in the quiet of those 3 months before he went back to work, was that importance was dangerous, that the life he had been building before, the papers, the reputation, the late nights and the cases that only he could crack, had cost him the years he should have been closer to home. He could not prove that staying closer to home would have changed anything about what happened to Rachel. He knew that, but he also could not shake the feeling that if you made yourself important, if you made yourself the person everyone needed, Then the world arranged itself around that importance, and the people you love became the ones who waited. He did not want Maya to spend her life waiting. He did not want to be 40 miles away when something happened. So he stayed small. He stayed invisible. He was nobody, by choice and by design, and for 3 years it worked exactly as he intended. What undid it was a color. On the morning of the Linda Halbert site inspection, John was completing his access-level walkthrough on the south face of the building when he passed the temporary catwalk that upper management used for exterior reviews. The platform was 60 feet long, bolted into the steel superstructure at the 38th floor level, designed to give inspectors a clean view of the building's progress without needing a full worksite suit. From a distance, it looked completely normal. The railing was straight. The non-slip panels were laid correctly. The bolts, from 15 feet away, appeared solid. But John Gabriel had spent 12 years learning to read metal. The part of his brain that had evaluated thousands of structural components had never switched off, no matter how many years he spent pushing a mop. It was looking at the bracket housing on the south end of the catwalk, and it was telling him that the color was wrong. The discoloration was slightly too orange. It was too even the way it spread around a joint, too consistent, too perfectly radiating outward from a contact point. Natural oxidation on a high-grade alloy does not look like that. Natural rust on a 14-month-old structure does not penetrate that depth, does not show that pattern of spread, does not have that uniform quality. What John was looking at was accelerated corrosion that had been introduced deliberately, using a chemical compound that targeted the specific alloy and sped its degradation by years. The joint at the base of that bracket was not just rusty. It was structurally compromised. It was, in the language he used to use every day and had not spoken aloud in 3 years, a pre-failure state. A significant weight load on the south end of that catwalk. 3 people, 5 people, would cause that bracket to give. John understood immediately what this meant. It meant the platform was a trap. It meant someone had deliberately set a failure point. It meant that Linda Halbert's inspection, scheduled for 11:30, which was 40 minutes away, was scheduled to walk directly into that trap. He tried his supervisor first. No answer. He tried the site manager's office. No answer. He tried the general site line and let it ring 12 times before he accepted that the telephone was not going to solve this problem. So he stopped being nobody. He took the stairwell to the 38th floor at the fastest pace that was not quite running, reached the catwalk access point at 11:17, and found the inspection group already present. Linda Halbert, 2 senior vice presidents, her COO Van Sterling, and a city planning official in a visitor's hard hat. They had already moved 20 feet along the platform toward the south end, toward the compromised bracket. John noted the positions of all 5 people in a single scan and understood that 2 of them, Linda and one of the VPs, were close enough to the south end to be in serious danger if the bracket gave. John went to the access door and said, loudly and clearly, that everyone needed to stop moving immediately. They stopped. The authority and the instruction reached them before the logic did, which is how it works on a construction site. Sterling turned around with the look of a man whose important meeting has been interrupted by the cleaning staff. The bracket gave before anyone could speak. It made a low, grating crack, and the south end of the catwalk dropped 8 inches as the compromised support buckled. Linda Halbert was closest to the south end. She had been standing there looking at the city view while Sterling talked, as she often did, her attention elsewhere even when her body was present. The platform's tilt sent her backward. She caught the railing with one hand. Her body swung out over 38 floors of open air. John covered the distance in 3 seconds and caught her wrist with both hands and held on with the kind of grip that does not ask permission. He braced his knees against the railing post and pulled, and she came back over the edge, and they both ended up on the catwalk floor. The other 4 members of the inspection group pressed themselves against the inside wall and did not move and did not speak. Sterling's expression had changed. He was no longer the man whose meeting had been interrupted by the cleaning staff. He was calculating something behind his eyes that John did not fully understand yet, but would understand later. When Linda asked who he was, John told her he was on the maintenance crew. When she asked what caused the failure, he told her it was accelerated corrosion, chemically induced, which meant deliberate. Sterling said it was a serious allegation. John said it was an observation, and that any materials lab could confirm it within 6 hours. Linda looked at Sterling for 3 seconds in a way that said a great deal without saying anything. Then she told John she wanted him in her office at 5 o'clock. What happened in the hours between the catwalk and John's arrival at Reed Global Headquarters was significant. Linda had her assistant pull John's employment records within 20 minutes of returning to her office and had the Human Resources Department run a background check within a half hour. What came back was a name John Gabriel on a maintenance contract, and 6 years behind that, Dr. John Gabriel, lead analyst at Meridian Structural Labs, co-author of 4 peer-reviewed publications, and the lead on the Decker River Bridge recertification, a project that the engineering world still cited as a benchmark for thoroughness. The gap between those two facts was 3 years, and Linda Halbert was intelligent enough to understand that a gap of that size between that kind of career and a maintenance position was a story, and that the story mattered. She had also, by 5 o'clock, made a decision. She had been running a company for 12 years on principle that the right person for a task was the person with both the skill and the motivation to do it precisely, and that motivation was often more important than skill, because skill could be borrowed, but motivation had to come from somewhere real. She did not know yet what John Gabriel's motivation was. She knew he had just identified a structural failure that nobody else on her team had found, had risked his body to prevent a death, and had named the cause with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was talking about. She intended to find out everything else. He told her he had a dentist appointment for his daughter at 2. She moved the meeting to 5. That afternoon, after the dentist and dinner, and Maya settled in for the night, John drove to Reed Global Headquarters in River North. Linda had done research in the hours between the catwalk and his arrival. She had found his employment history, found the gap between Meridian and Orion Heights, found his publications, and read the Decker River Bridge report. She told him all of this directly, without preamble, because she was the kind of person who did not perform ignorance she did not have. She offered him a job. Not maintenance, an investigation. She wanted him to go through every material certification, every supplier invoice, every procurement record for 14 months of Orion Heights construction, and tell her exactly what he found. He would keep appearing on the maintenance roster so that nobody knew what he was actually doing. His salary would be adjusted. His medical debt would be cleared as part of the contract. The debt, $114,000. The number on the inside of his notebook. 9 more years. Maya at 16. John sat with the offer for a moment. He understood that she was not bribing him. She was demonstrating seriousness. She was telling him that she understood the weight of what she was asking, and that she intended to match it. He accepted. He told her that he would tell her everything he found, whatever it turned out to be, and that she had to agree to act on it. She agreed. They shook hands. John drove home and did not open his novel that morning, because he was already awake at 4, already thinking, his mind moving across the problem the way it had always moved, quickly, hungrily, with the particular pleasure of a brain doing the work it was built for. He had not realized, in 3 years of novels and 5:15 mornings, how much he had missed thinking hard about things that mattered. There was also the question of what Linda Halbert herself represented. John had seen her twice before at a distance, once in a lobby and once during a routine upper-floor walkthrough, and had formed the impression that most people who worked near her formed, that she was a woman of considerable intelligence and very little warmth, someone who ran a company the way a surgeon runs an operating room, with precision and without sentiment. The executives who surrounded her moved differently when she was present. They were more careful with their words and less relaxed in their postures. Her COO, Sterling, was voluble and self-assured in her absence, and noticeably more measured when she was in the room. Linda herself was the kind of person who generated a field around her, not of fear exactly, but of attention, the kind of attention that people give to things that matter and that are watching them back. John had not had a conversation with her before that afternoon. He had observed her the way he observed most things at the site, from a professional distance, with mild interest and no personal involvement. He had not imagined having a reason to talk to her. He had certainly not imagined that the first real conversation between them would happen on the floor of a broken catwalk with the city wind coming in cold off the lake. But Linda Halbert was, John would come understand, Someone who met the significant moments of her life with a kind of focused practicality that looked like coldness to people who did not understand it. She had come close to dying that morning, and her response was to schedule a meeting, ask the right questions, and act on the answers. This was not because she was unafraid or unhurt by what had happened. It was because she understood that in a moment when someone was trying to kill you using your own building, the most useful thing you could do was find out what else they had built into it. John understood this kind of thinking. It was his own kind of thinking. He had spent 3 years trying to turn it off and had not succeeded. John spent the first 3 days working to procurement records a way he had always worked through difficult material, systematically, from the beginning, cross-referencing everything, trusting nothing at face value. The first significant finding came on day 3. Every structural material delivered to a project the size of Orion Heights comes with a batch certification document, a record that verifies the delivered material matches the grade and specification that was ordered and paid for. The certifications in the Reed Global files looked completely legitimate at a glance. They were formatted correctly. They carried the right supplier headers, and the batch numbers were formatted in the exact way that genuine certification numbers are formatted. A routine audit review would have cleared them without a second look, but John did not do routine reviews. He ran every batch number against the supplier's public certification registry, a database that logs every certified batch a manufacturer produces, accessible to any licensed auditor. The batch numbers in the Reed Global files did not exist in the registry. They pointed to batches that had never been manufactured or certified. The documents were fabricated from the ground up, accurate-looking fakes built by someone who understood exactly how certification documents were structured and exactly what a routine check would and would not look for. This meant that the materials actually delivered to Orion Heights were not the materials that the paperwork described. John cross-referenced the delivery weights against the site receiving logs and found consistent discrepancies. The delivered materials were lighter than the certified specifications indicated they should be. Lighter material meant cheaper material, a lower-grade substitute that could pass a visual inspection by someone who was not specifically looking for the difference, but that behaved fundamentally differently under structural load. The gap between what Reed Global had paid for and what had actually been delivered represented an enormous sum when calculated across 14 months of construction. Over the next 8 days, John built a complete picture of the substitution scheme. The column foundations on floors 20 through 35 had been specified with solid steel reinforced cores and poured instead with a cheaper concrete mixture that had roughly half the load tolerance of the specification. 12 crane cables had been ordered as high-tensile aircraft-grade steel and received as standard commercial wire rope, a substitution that looks invisible to anyone who has not specifically tested the tensile rating, but that fails under sustained heavy load at a completely different rate than the specified material. The support beams on the east face had been ordered with a genuine corrosion-resistant coating and treated, instead, with cosmetic sealant that looked identical on a visual inspection but offered no meaningful protection against the freeze-thaw cycles and moisture exposure of Chicago winter. The sealant will hold for 2 or 3 years and then begin to fail, and the beams underneath will begin to degrade. There were 17 separate instances of material substitution that John was able to document in the first 12 days. Every single one traced back to a falsified certification document. Every single one pointed to the same pattern. Premium materials ordered, inferior materials delivered, the difference in cost diverted somewhere that was not on the official books. Taken together, the picture was stark. Orion Heights was not a building with some maintenance concerns or some substandard corner cutting that a remediation program could address. It was a building that had been systematically constructed to fail. Not immediately. The substitutions were sophisticated enough that the building would pass routine inspections for years. But under the kind of sustained real-world loading that a fully occupied 60-story mixed-use tower experiences routinely, wind shear, occupancy weight, seismic tremors, years of thermal cycling, the hollow foundations and compromised cables and degraded beams would eventually give. The building would not fall on the day it opened. It might stand for 5 years, or 8 years, or 10, but it would fall. And when it did, it would fall on people. John documented every finding with the same patience and precision he had brought to every structural analysis he had ever conducted. He built a cross-reference record that traced each substitution back to its origin document, its authorization code, and its payment trail. The record was the kind that held up under serious scrutiny because it was sourced entirely from primary documents and required no interpretive leaps. The evidence said what it said. Working through files brought back something that John had not expected, a quality of satisfaction that if forgotten was possible. Not happiness, exactly, more like rightness. The feeling of using the thing you were built for on the thing it was built for. He had spent 3 years applying a precise and sophisticated intelligence to fire extinguisher brackets and mop schedules and the careful logging of bulb replacements, and there had been a cost to that, one he had not fully admitted to himself, because admitting it would have required him to want something he had decided he could not have. Now he was inside a problem that required everything he had, and his mind moved through it with the ease of a person working in their native language after years of speaking in a foreign one. He thought about Maya sometimes, in the back office, in the afternoons when the sight and noise filtered through the small window. He thought about what she would say when she was old enough to understand what he had done here. Not the maintenance work, but this, the investigation, the careful rebuilding of a record that someone had worked hard to obscure. He thought she would say that this was more like him. He thought she would be right. On the 11th day, John found the memos. They were in a folder on the project's private server, labeled Legacy Correspondence. It was the kind of folder name that makes its content invisible, because nobody goes looking in a folder called that. John went looking in every folder without exception, because that was his discipline, and because he had learned over many years of analysis that the thing you are not supposed to find is usually in the folder that looks the most boring. There were 43 memos. They were from 6 years earlier. They described a severe financial crisis at Reed Global, a credit market downturn that had nearly collapsed the company entirely. During those months, Reed Global was completing a 20-story residential tower in Evanston called Harborview, and the memos detailed a set of cost reduction measures implemented during that project's construction to keep the company solvent. The language in the memos was clinical and businesslike, the language of people making difficult decisions under pressure and documenting those decisions carefully because they understood the legal territory they were entering. The measures included material substitution, the same kind, lower-grade materials delivered under the paperwork of premium ones. The cost difference diverted to shore up the company's liquidity. Different building, different materials, different year, but the same method, the same structure, the same logic. At the bottom of every single memo, on the approved by line, was a signature. The name was Linda Halbert. John read the memos 3 times before he did anything else. He read them slowly and carefully, the way he always read something when the implications were going to be significant. He wanted to be certain that he was seeing what he was seeing. He was seeing it. Linda had authorized the Harborview substitutions 6 years ago, under severe financial pressure, to prevent the company from collapsing and 700 people from losing their jobs. The Harborview building had not fallen. The substitutions there had been severe enough to be wrong, but not so severe that the structure had become catastrophically unsafe. She had walked a line that was morally and legally compromised and had come out on the other side of it with the company intact and the building standing. And she had not told John any of this when she hired him. She had framed the investigation as something being done to her. Corruption inside her company, a COO who was stealing from a project and threatening her life. She had not said, "By the way, I did something similar once," and the records proving it are in a server folder that anyone with senior access can find, and the person who is doing this to me now may have found them. John understood now why the scheme was so well constructed. Van Sterling had not simply decided to steal from a project. He had found the Harborview memos, understood exactly what they meant, and designed a fraud that mirrored Linda's own methods closely enough that it would be almost impossible for her to expose it without exposing herself. The shell entities and the diversion accounts were Sterling's profit. The Harborview memos were his insurance. If Linda tried to stop him, he could destroy her. If she tried to expose him, she went down with him. He had built himself a position where the only person who had both the knowledge and the motive to oppose him was also the person most damaged by the truth coming out. The catwalk sabotage fit this logic perfectly. Linda had brought John in, which meant she was planning to fight rather than cover things up. Sterling had responded by trying to remove her before the investigation could produce anything usable. It was not a crime of passion. It was a calculated move. John sent Linda a message telling her the meeting needed to happen that day. He printed the memos and put them in a folder and drove to her office. When he put the folder on her desk and she read the memos, Linda did not argue and she did not pretend. She said she had been 41 years old and 60 days from financial collapse, that she had believed at the time that survivable was close enough to acceptable, and that she had spent 6 years not thinking about it with the clarity she was being forced to use right now. She said the Harborview building was still standing. She said she knew that did not make it right. John told her he understood the circumstances and was not there to judge the past. He was there because what was happening at Orion Heights was not survivable. The Harborview margins had been pushed but workable. The Orion Heights substitutions were a different category entirely. This was not someone stretching the limits of what a building could tolerate. This was someone building a building that was going to kill people, and doing it knowingly, and doing it in a way that had been designed to make her either complicit or destroyed. Linda looked at the memos on her desk. She said she thought Sterling had found the Harborview records and used them as a template. John confirmed that was exactly what the evidence showed. He told her there was one more thing in the files that he had not yet fully processed, and he needed 2 more days before he could bring her the complete picture. She told him to find it. Listen, if you're still here, it means you're invested. You want to see what happens next. But here's the reality. Most people watch stories like this and scroll away without subscribing. They enjoy it, then vanish. If this story actually matters to you, if you genuinely care about how it ends, hit that subscribe button. It only takes a second. Otherwise, you'll probably forget this channel exists and miss all the other incredible stories I share. The second folder was inside a compliance archive on the server labeled Flagged Legal Review. The folder metadata showed it had not been accessed in over 3 years. Inside were 14 documents organized by date. The first one was created on March 14th and the last on June 8th, all within the same 12-week period. They were internal audit reports, structured, thorough cross-reference, the kind of work that a trained financial analyst produces when they are building a file they intend to hand to a regulator. The documents covered the Orion Heights project at an earlier stage of construction. They documented the hollow column pours, the first set of cable substitutions, the initial round of falsified batch certifications. The work was precise and professionally organized. The person who had built this file had understood exactly what they were looking at, had gathered the right evidence, and had assembled it in a form that would hold up to serious scrutiny. It was, in John's professional judgment, a better preliminary audit than most experienced compliance officers could have produced. In the file metadata at the bottom of each document, where software records the name of the person who created the file, was one name, R. Gabriel. John did not move from his chair for a long time. Rachel Gabriel had been his wife. She had been a junior financial analyst who specialized in compliance auditing. She had been the kind of professional who found satisfaction in the careful reading of numbers, in the patient assembly of evidence, in doing meticulous work in rooms where nobody was watching, and the only audience was the quality of the file itself. John had known that she consulted for various clients. He had known that confidentiality was part of how she worked. He had never asked which clients, because that was a professional norm and because they trusted each other completely, and neither of them had thought to question whether trust required full disclosure of every job she took. He had not known she had been inside Reed Global's records. He had not known she had found the Orion Heights fraud. He had not known she had spent the last 12 weeks of her life building a case against it. Rachel died on June 22nd. The last document in the folder was dated June 8th. 14 days between her final report and the day she died. John sat with this fact in the quiet of the back office and let it settle fully before he allowed himself to think about what it might or might not mean. He was, above everything else, a scientist. He had spent his entire professional life in the discipline of distinguishing between what the evidence actually showed and what he wanted to show. He knew that correlation was not causation. He knew that the timing of two events, even striking timing, did not constitute proof of a connection between them. He knew that a brain aneurysm was a documented medical event with a documented family history in Rachel's case, and that the hospital's assessment had been delivered by qualified physicians who had no reason to reach any conclusion other than the one the evidence supported. He also knew that Van Sterling had been running a scheme that had already produced one attempted murder, the catwalk sabotage, and that Sterling had almost certainly known, given his access to the server archives, that there was a junior analyst somewhere quietly building a case against him. He knew that the case had stopped being built 14 days before Rachel died. He knew that the file had been sitting in an archive folder labeled Flagged. Legal review for 3 years without being accessed, which was either coincidence or something else. He was not going to claim to know which one it was. He did not have the evidence to make that claim. What he had was a timeline and a name and an obligation to make sure that both of them ended up in front of investigators who had more access than he did and more authority to look harder. What he felt, sitting alone in that back office with his wife's name on a metadata field, was something he did not have precise language for. It was not surprise. He had learned years ago that grief has more rooms than you ever finish finding. It was not anger exactly, though anger was in the vicinity. It was something closer to recognition. He had spent 3 years believing that Rachel's death was a private tragedy, a random and cruel medical event that had no meaning beyond the simple, terrible fact of it. He had built his life around that understanding. Now he was sitting inside a server archive with evidence that the last thing she had done, the thing she had quietly and carefully given the last 12 weeks of her working life to, was this case, this fraud, these 14 documents. She had found it before he had. She had been here first. She had started the work and had not been able to finish it, and John had come along 3 years later, for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this, and had followed the same thread she had followed, and arrived at the same place she had been trying to reach. He was finishing her work. He did not know yet what to do with that fact emotionally, and he accepted that he would not know for a long time. What he knew how to do was the work itself. So he copied all 14 of Rachel's documents to a secure drive, organized them alongside his own findings, and built a complete record that was now 14 reports richer and 3 years deeper than it had been that morning. John had known Rachel for 9 years before she died. They had met at a professional conference when she was 27 and he was 29 at a panel discussion about financial oversight in infrastructure projects, and he had thought at the time that she was the most precise thinker in the room and also the funniest person he had ever met, and that those two qualities seemed in her case to be connected rather than intention. They were married 2 years later. Maya came 3 years after that. By the time Rachel died, they had been building a life together for 7 years, which was long enough to know each other deeply, and not long enough, which is always the case, and always will be. He had not, in 3 years of grieving her, been angry. He had been sad and tired, and occasionally undone in the middle of ordinary moments, when something reminded him of her in a way he had not prepared for. He had been all those things. He had not been angry because there was nothing to be angry at. A random cardiovascular event has no author, no motive, no face you can direct the feeling toward. Now, there was a possibility, even an unproven one, that there was a face. And John did not know what to do with that, so he did what he had always done when he encountered something he could not yet resolve. He documented it and handed it to the people whose job it was to resolve it, and he kept working. He sent Linda a message telling her he needed to meet that evening, and that she should bring no one else. When he told her about Rachel, the name, the dates, the 14 reports, the timeline, Linda was quiet for a long time. She said she had not known. John said he knew she had not. He was not there to add to the accusations. He was there to complete the picture the way they had agreed he would. Then he told her the full picture of Sterling's scheme. The authorization codes on the fraudulent procurement orders were designed to trace back to a mid-level procurement officer on the Orion Heights team, a man named Davies who had been set up as the fall guy from the beginning, inserted into the paper trail carefully enough that a standard investigation would stop at him and go no further. John had not stopped at Davies. He had followed the financial flows behind the authorization codes to 3 shell entities registered in Delaware, entities that existed on paper only and whose sole function was to receive diverted funds from the material substitution scheme. The founding documents for all 3 shell entities had been filed by the same attorney, a man whose firm had handled the private financial affairs of Van Sterling's personal holding company for 11 years. The money flowing into those shell entities had not been sitting idle. Sterling had been accumulating a position. Over 3 years of sustained diversion, he had built a fund large enough to purchase a controlling interest in 2 of Reed Global's key institutional lenders. Once that purchase was complete, Sterling would have had the ability to call those loans at a moment of his choosing, to trigger a default that would put Reed Global under financial stress severe enough to force a restructuring. In a restructuring, with controlling positions in the key lenders and the Harborview memos as protection against Linda fighting back, Sterling would have been positioned to acquire the company at a fraction of its actual value. It was a hostile takeover from the inside. It had been running for 3 years. The building currently going up in the West Loop was the funding mechanism, and the 200 people who were eventually going to occupy it were the risk that Sterling had decided he was comfortable with. Linda said they had to move that night, before Sterling had any warning that the documentation was complete. John agreed. She picked up her phone. Linda called the FBI herself. She used her personal phone, not the office line, because she was already considering the possibility that Sterling had monitoring in place on the company's internal communications. She called the direct line of the federal agent who handled construction fraud for the Chicago field office, a man she knew professionally, and she gave him the full picture in 22 minutes. She did not manage the information. She did not lead with the parts that made her look best. She told him about the Orion Heights substitutions, Sterling's shell entities and financial scheme, the catwalk sabotage, and her own history with the Harborview project 6 years earlier. She said she was prepared to cooperate fully and that the documentation was complete and organized. The agent told her not to access the server archives further. He said a team would be at her office at 7 in the morning. While Linda was on the call, John reached the head of Reed Global Building Security on a personal number and had the server room locked down before Sterling could access it. Sterling had used his executive badge to enter the building at 7:48 that evening and was still inside. They found him in the server room, standing at a terminal, calm in a way that a man is calm when he has already understood that the game is ended and has decided in advance how he intends to behave in that moment. He did not run. He did not destroy anything. He looked at John and said he should have paid more attention to the janitor. John told him yes, he should have. Sterling asked how much documentation existed. John told him everything. Sterling's jaw moved slightly. He looked at the terminal and then back at them. He said the authorization codes were constructed to trace to Davies, not to him. John said he had followed the trail past Davies to the Delaware entities and back to Sterling's personal attorney. Sterling absorbed this with the stillness of a chess player acknowledging a move that closes the board. He said nothing after that. The security guards moved him out of the building. He did not resist. The FBI team arrived at 7 the next morning. John spent 7 hours walking 2 agents through the full documentation, cross-reference by cross-reference, report by report. He explained the material science, the certification falsifications, the alloy substitutions, the structural implications of the hollow foundations, and the compromise cables. He explained the financial architecture, the authorization codes, the diversion flows, the Delaware shell entities, the lender acquisition strategy. He was patient and precise, and by midday the agents understood that the case had been essentially assembled for them. What they were receiving was not raw information that needed organization. It was a finished record. Davies, the procurement officer Sterling had built into the paper trail as a fall guy, was released from questioning once the documentation made clear that he had been set up rather than complicit. He had signed documents he had been told were standard procurement authorizations, not understanding what they were actually authorizing. The agents confirmed this within 2 hours of receiving John's file. Sterling was formally charged with wire fraud, construction materials fraud, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, and 1 count related to the deliberate structural sabotage of the catwalk platform. His attorneys entered an initial plea that evening. The prosecutor handling the case told Linda's legal team that the documentation John had produced was among the most thorough they had seen on a materials fraud case of this size. The investigation into Rachel's death was formally flagged for the FBI team at Linda's attorney's request. John did not go to the investigators with a theory. He went with the timeline, the metadata, the server access logs, and the 14 documents, and he told them what he could prove and what he could not. And he asked them to look at it with the tools and access that he did not have. Whether they found anything or found nothing, he had done what Rachel herself would have done, documented it, handed it to the right people, let the process do its work. That was all he had, and it was enough. It had to be. Linda called a board meeting the morning after Sterling's arrest and told the board everything. She told them about the Orion Heights fraud and Sterling's scheme. She told them about the Harborview memos and what she had personally authorized 6 years ago under financial pressure. She told them that she was voluntarily disclosing both matters to the financial regulators and to the city. She did not soften any of it. She did not bring lawyers into the room to manage the narrative. She laid the full record on the table and told the board that she intended to file a demolition order for Orion Heights that afternoon. The board was resistant in the way that boards are resistant when very expensive things are at stake. $200 million of construction, 60% complete, and the argument for remediation rather than demolition was financially compelling on its face. Several directors pushed for it. Linda told them that she had consulted with John Gabriel, whose professional assessment was that the foundation work at Orion Heights was too comprehensively compromised for surface remediation to be structurally sufficient. The hollow column pours could not be reinforced adequately from above. The cable substitutions created load-bearing vulnerabilities that no amount of supplementary work could fully address without rebuilding from the ground up. Completing the building as it currently stood and hoping it would survive occupancy was not an acceptable business decision. It was a gamble with other people's lives, and she was not willing to make it. She also told the board that if they voted against the demolition, she would resign and make her case publicly, and that the reputational damage of a CEO publicly accusing her own board of choosing financial preservation over structural safety would be significantly more costly than the demolition itself. The board voted to approve the demolition. The city issued its own stop work order 2 days later, after the independent structural review commissioned by the inspector's office confirmed every finding John had documented. The review team was specific and unambiguous in its language. Orion Heights, as constructed, was not a building with addressable problems. It was a hazard. The demolition order was filed before the end of the week. The Harborview building in Evanston was put under an independent structural review at Linda's personal request. The findings were less severe. The Harborview substitutions had been within ranges the structure could sustain, and the building was not in imminent danger. But several significant reinforcements were identified and recommended. Linda funded all of them immediately and without negotiating the scope. She also sent written notification to every current resident of Harborview, explaining the history of the review and its findings in plain language, without minimizing what had happened. This was not legally required. She did it anyway. Reed Global's public statement was released the same week. It acknowledged the fraud, the investigation, Sterling's charges, the Orion Heights demolition, and the Harborview disclosures. Linda's name appeared in the statement in connection with the Harborview authorizations. For 2 weeks, she was a subject of significant press attention and a great deal of professional commentary. She did not manage the coverage. She did not issue additional statements designed to soften her image or shift the narrative. She went to work every day and kept her attention on what needed to be done. 3 weeks after Sterling's arrest, Linda offered John a formal position at Reed Global. The role was newly created, head of safety integrity. It carried a full departmental budget, complete access to every current and future project's procurement and certification records from the earliest planning stage forward, and a reporting line that went directly to her. The job was to audit Reed Global structural integrity from the ground up on every project, at every phase of construction, with full authority to flag problems and halt work and escalate findings. It was, in every practical sense, the job of making sure that what had happened at Orion Heights could never happen again under a Reed Global project banner. The salary was more than he had earned at Meridian. The medical debt would be cleared as part of his contract on the day he signed. John took 2 days to think about it. He thought about what it meant to stop being invisible. He had chosen invisibility 3 years ago with real intention and real reasons, and the understanding that staying small was how you protected the people who depended on you. He had built a life around that understanding. The 5:15 mornings and the thick novels and the maintenance rounds and the number 16 on the inside cover of his notebook, all of it had been built on the same foundation. That being nobody was safer than being somebody, for himself and for Maya both. He thought about whether that had ever been true, or whether it had been grief dressed up as wisdom. He thought about the fact that he had been invisible for 3 years, and the building had been going up wrong for 3 years, and the people who were eventually going to live in it had been getting closer to a catastrophe for 3 years, and none of that had been stopped by his invisibility. It had been stopped by him walking through an access door and saying the words he had been trained to say. He thought about Rachel. She had never made invisibility into a virtue. She had believed that the work mattered, and that doing it well was how you took care of the world, not a threat to the people you loved. She had walked into Reed Global's archive and found the fraud and spent 12 weeks building the case in the careful, patient way she did everything, because that was who she was, and because she understood that staying quiet when you saw something wrong was its own kind of harm. She had been right about all of it. She had been right about what mattered and what silence cost. He had been finishing her work for 3 weeks without fully naming it that way to himself. He was naming it now. He signed the contract. The day he signed, the financial team at Reed Global processed the medical debt clearance. $114,000. Gone in a single transaction that took about 4 minutes to execute and had taken 3 years of morning coffee and 5:15 alarms and the number 16 written in a notebook to prepare for. John did not feel dramatic about it. He felt clean. He felt like a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had set it down and was now looking at his own hands and remembering what they were for. He gave notice on his maintenance position on a Friday. His supervisor, Garrett, who had always been decent to him, shook his hand and said he had no idea. John said he knew. Garrett said it explained why the third-floor equipment logs had always been unusually precise. John said it probably did. He started the new role on a Monday, in a real office with his name on the door and a blank departmental charter waiting to be written. He wrote it with the same patience and precision he had brought to every piece of work in his life, every checkpoint, every supplier verification protocol, every certification audit step, every material test that would be mandatory before a single load-bearing component went into a Reed Global structure going forward. He wrote the charter as if he were building a structure himself, from the foundation up, with every joint and connection specified and nothing left to assumption. The charter had a section on independent verification. It had a section on supplier registry cross-referencing. It had a section on batch certification protocols that required physical sample testing, not just documentation review, at every stage of delivery. It had a section on whistleblower access, a confidential channel through which any person at any level of a Reed Global project could report a structural concern without going to a chain of command that might have reasons to suppress it. John had put that section in because of Rachel, because she had found the fraud and built the case in a server folder with nobody to hand it to, and had run out of time before she could reach anyone who had the authority to act. He intended to make sure that the next person who found something had somewhere to go. It took 3 days to write the charter properly. He did not rush. The week after the charter was filed, Linda sent it to the city's building inspection department, the state construction oversight office, and 2 structural engineering associations as a public document. She told John she wanted it on record that Reed Global was not simply making internal promises. She wanted the standards to be external and verifiable, so that any future deviation would be visible to people outside the company. John said that was the right call. She said she knew it was. She said she had learned something about the cost of keeping things internal. The board had responded to the public release of the charter with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Several directors thought it was unnecessarily aggressive, that publishing detailed internal protocols invited scrutiny that could have been avoided. Linda told them that avoiding scrutiny was how Orion Heights had happened, and that she was not interested in any strategy that began with the assumption that being watched was a problem. The conversation was, John was told later, relatively brief. On the Saturday after his first full week, John took Maya to Millennium Park. It was October and cold and bright, and Maya wanted to see the Cloud Gate sculpture, which she had been calling the Cloud Bean since she was 4, and showed no signs of stopping. They found a dry patch of grass near the sculpture and sat in the afternoon sun. Maya had a chocolate ice cream cone and was in the process of making it disappear with a systematic efficiency she applied to things she enjoyed. John had a notepad on his knee because he always had a notepad on his knee. He had been drawing without a specific intention, the old engineering habit. Just lines at first, and then the lines had started to become something. It was a building. He was drawing it from the foundation up. He drew it the way a building is supposed to be built. Honestly, with the correct materials at every level, with every joint and beam and fastener specified and verifiable, with nothing hidden and nothing substituted, and nothing designed to look like something it was not. He drew it as if every person who would ever live or work inside it was watching while he did, which was, he thought, the way every building ought to be drawn. Maya looked over and told him it needed more windows. John added more windows, more than the structural logic strictly required, more than seemed proportionally necessary from a design standpoint. He added them until the building facade was full of them, light coming in from every level. Maya approved. She said buildings with more windows were happier buildings because the light got in better and things that had light in them were easier to trust. She said this with the certainty of a 7-year-old who has thought about a subject carefully and arrived at a conclusion she is confident in. John told her she was right. He meant it about more than the building. John looked at the drawing for a while. He thought about honest structures, about the difference between a building that looks solid and a building that is solid. The same difference that exists between a person presenting a version of themselves designed for safety and a person standing in a room as they actually are. He had spent 3 years building the first kind of life. He was not sure anymore that it had ever been as safe as it felt. He thought about what it cost to be invisible, not in the obvious ways, the salary, the debt, the 9 years, but in the harder to name ways. The cost of knowing something and not saying it. The cost of walking past a bracket that was going to fail and almost not stopping. The cost of 3 years of proving to himself every morning that he was not the person he actually was. He had told himself it was protection. From Maya, from grief, from the kind of loss that comes when you become important and are then taken away from the people who depend on you. But staying small had not protected anything. It had made everything smaller. Rachel had believed that the work mattered, and that doing it well was a form of care, not a threat to the people you loved. She had been right. She had spent her last 12 weeks in a server archive, doing careful work for nobody watching, because she understood that silence had a price, and that the price was eventually paid by someone who had no idea it was coming. He had understood this about her while she was alive. He had not let himself hold it fully until now. He put the notepad away. Maya finished her ice cream and leaned against his arm in the October sun, and a cloud beam reflected the whole Chicago skyline back at them in a wide curved mirror that made everything look slightly different than it was. Taller and broader and more connected than the real buildings, all of them bending toward each other in the reflection in a way they did not quite do in the actual sky. He was going back into the world, his name on the door, his eyes open, ready to find what needed finding, in the way that Rachel had always been ready, without armor, without the pretense of smallness, with a plain understanding that the work mattered and silence had a cost, and the honest thing, in the end, was also the only thing that held. He was ready. Every great skill you build and every honest effort you make is never wasted, even when life forces you set aside. John Gabriel spent 3 years hiding his genius behind a mop and a maintenance uniform, convinced that staying small was how he protected the people he loved. But the moment the world needed exactly what he was, everything he had ever learned showed up ready. His wife Rachel did the same thing quietly in a server archive no one would ever see, building a careful case against a fraud that threatened thousands of lives, trusting that the work mattered even if she never got to finish it. Together. Their story teaches us that integrity is not about recognition. It is about doing the right thing thoroughly and honestly even when no one is watching, even when it costs you, and trusting that truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way to the surface. Before you go, let me ask you something that if this story kept you listening until now. Why not subscribe? A lot of people watch. A lot of people enjoy. But most never click that button. Don't just be a viewer. Be part of this. Like the video if it hit. Share it with someone who'd love it. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next. And drop a comment telling me your favorite part of the story. I really want to know what stood out to you, though, and be honest. Do you want part 2?